Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Major General Praveen. It's always a pleasure to interact with children and to interact with law students and to share my experience in the legal profession and try to give them my view on these very important subjects that you put for me today. According to me, this is today one of the most important subjects which concerns the Indian judiciary, both on the question of the independence of the judiciary as well as on the question of judicial overreach. As far as the independence of judiciary is concerned, we have a system where under the constitution, the judges were to be appointed by the government and by the Supreme Court, by a judgment of the Supreme Court. Now this appointment has been taken away from the government and the final say in appointments is with the Supreme Court itself. And that is one of the ways in which the independence of the judiciary is sought to be sort of maintained in India. The relevance of taking away the power of appointment of judges from the executive was primarily because you will see that most of the political parties and their leaders are facing very, very important cases which are at various stages, some in criminal cases and some other serious cases of Prevention of Corruption Act, etc. So to expect them to appoint independent people was considered to be not possible or not, sort of forthcoming. So that was one reason why the Supreme Court felt that if this appointment is with the Supreme Court itself, then they will be in a better position to maintain the independence of the judiciary. Now, as far as the appointment process is concerned, because I very strongly feel that although the power to appoint should remain with the judiciary, like it is by virtue of that judgment, but that power should be exercised more responsibly. And I feel that the present dispensation, the manner in which judges are being appointed to the higher judiciary, a lot is desired because there is no, firstly, there is no evaluation of, the people who are there who can be considered for appointment, and there is no objectivity in such appointment. And I have felt that the government could, instead of fighting a turf war of seeking to have a final say on the appointment, the government can legislate and bring in a law to regulate the collegium system. In fact, I have drafted one such law also, and I have given it to the government for its consideration. I don't know at what stage it is. I mentioned this to the Attorney General also, and he also felt that yes, something like this should be done, but probably our parliamentarians have more important things to do, so probably they have not had the time to look into this. But according to me, if there is a law to govern the collegium system, then we can ensure that far better people are appointed to the higher judiciary, and the appointment is done in a more transparent process. And because ultimately the integrity of the judiciary will always depend on the kind of people we appoint to the higher judiciary. And if the better people get appointed, then definitely the judicial dispensation will be far better, and the access to justice will also improve. And we will have more, satisfied people with the functioning of the judiciary than as of now. Because you will all appreciate if you have been watching the Indian judiciary in the last couple of years. Although the appointment process is with the Supreme Court, but in the last 2-3 years, especially the tenure of previous Chief Justice and also the tenure before that, there have been a feeling in the mind of the common man, and also more importantly in the minds of the independent-minded lawyers of Supreme Court, that the judiciary is not functioning that independently, and it is taking, it is being dictated by the executive, which is a very dangerous thing to happen in any healthy democracy, because for a democracy to survive and for a democracy to, be really throbbing and be vibrant, we must have a very independent judiciary. And when we say independent judiciary means that it should not only be, but also appear to be completely away from the pressure of the government, and to have its say in deciding matters purely by law rather than by factors that it is to decide things. It should not decide things against the government. So this law which I had suggested was to have a system where every high court can have, some kind of a benchmark or some kind of a minimum requirement for bringing in names to be considered for appointment. And for instance, every high court could have a minimum income. Every high court will have a different income threshold for being considered. For instance, Bombay will have a much higher income threshold. Patna will have a much lower income threshold. So every high court should have a minimum income criteria that a lawyer should be giving a certain amount of returned income for being considered to being elevated. Then there should be a criteria for having a certain number of reported cases to his name of having argued. And that should also be a minimum criteria for being considered. And then there could be also a case of what kind of pro bono work or work for the downtrodden you've done, or public interest litigations you've argued. These are issues which I feel should be very, very important for deciding who all should be in the select list for being considered as judges. Once that exercise is done, because today fortunately we have the online availability of a lot of data, there will also of course be an age gap, because there is a minimum age and a maximum age at which you can be appointed to the High Court. So there should be that fourth criteria. And in those four criteria, all the names that fall for that particular High Court should be considered by the collegium. And the collegium should then recommend names only of people after considering each and every name that they find in that criteria list. So the idea is that the collegium today, what it is doing, it is, three members of the collegium, one knows X, Y, Z, one knows A, B, C, and the third knows, DX, DFY. So they basically select amongst the 9 people they know, and there is no objectivity in the selection of judges, and that is why the quality of judges is going down, and that ultimately reflects on the independence of the judiciary. So this exercise which is being done, or in the manner in which it is being done, a lot needs to be done to improve that, and that could be done either by self-discipline, because I had also written to Justice Lodha when he was Chief Justice of India, making these same suggestions, that he could if he could consider this in the next Chief Justice's conference and make some kind of a code of conduct within the judiciary itself, and ensure that this code of conduct is followed by everybody. But unfortunately, he also did not think it important enough to take it up in the Chief Justice's conference. So then I made a law for this purpose, and I have given it to the government to have a look. And if they can make that kind of a law, then this will definitely streamline the appointment of the higher judiciary. And similar criteria was also suggested by me for Supreme Court, because what is happening again in Supreme Court is that the idea should be to get the best people in the high courts, and the best people can only be selected by some kind of an objective criteria which will have to be formulated. So these are basically broadly important considerations for the independence of the judiciary. And if these are followed in true letter and spirit, then we can have a far more independent judiciary and far more vibrant judiciary in this country. But the second part of this topic is actually more of my liking, because that is an area where also I have done a lot of service to the institution by pointing out to the Supreme Court that its jurisdiction is limited, and it cannot transgress into the field of the executive or the field of the legislature, which unfortunately the court keeps on doing every day. And it's a very unfortunate part that very few lawyers, whether it be government lawyers or private lawyers, tell the court that you are exceeding your jurisdiction, and because of which the transgression takes place on a daily basis. So I sincerely feel that the lines of the judiciary vis-a-vis the executive and the legislature are all very clearly defined. But though the judiciary has the authority and the power to check the executive and the legislature, unfortunately, the executive and the legislature have no similar power to check the judiciary. So ultimately, the judiciary becomes the final arbiter in such matters. So what happens is that the judicial overreach is to be brought about by self-restraint, and there is no other way, because the moment you comment on the judiciary, it becomes contempt of court, and so nobody dares to say anything against them. And if the parliament were to pass a law, or even if the parliament were to bring in a constitutional amendment by 2/3 majority of the parliament, two judges sitting in Supreme Court or even one judge sitting in the High Court can set aside and can annul that law by saying that it is contrary to the constitutional scheme or contrary to the basic structure of the Constitution. So that is the kind of judicial power that the judges enjoy. But if they decide to go into a field which is exclusively reserved for the executive or for the legislature, then there is no such power for the legislature or the executive to tell the judiciary that, look here, this is not something which is in your domain, and that you should confine yourself to decision making and not get into areas which is beyond your remit. So in this regard, there are some very important cases that I argued, which I thought I will share with all of you. The Supreme Court, as you will know, all of you will know that is monitoring the environment in this country, and it's there are several judgments, several cases like the T.N. Godavarman case, or there are several other cases where they are giving continuing mandamus to the government and saying what all should be done and what all should not be done to save the environment. So nobody has any grouse with the petition by the Supreme Court on the environment, because these are something which I also feel that in the PIL jurisdiction should be there with the courts, and the court should look into these aspects. But how and to what extent is a debatable question. So in that regard, there was a case in the Supreme Court when I was the Additional Solicitor General, and the question arose as to that there is a Forest Advisory Committee under the Forest Act, and then Forest Advisory Committee is to be constituted by the central government. So I was representing the central government, and it was before the Chief Justice's bench of Justice Sabharwal. And Justice Sabharwal, during the course of the hearing, gave me a list, and he said, Mr. Singh, we want these people to be appointed as member of the Forest Advisory Committee. Now, that was something which I felt was clearly transgression of the power of the court, because the court can't suggest whom to appoint. The court can definitely say that what needs to be done, and if it is not being done, applaud the executive to do it. So, for instance, if there is a mangrove which needs to be protected, or there is a endangered species which need to be protected, then court can say that you bring in some law or some notification or some provision by which you protect this part of the environment. But who will be in the Forest Advisory Committee is not for the Supreme Court to decide. So when I've raised this argument, the Chief Justice of India, Justice Sabharwal, said that, Mr. Singh, there have been so many Attorney Generals and so many Solicitor Generals who have come before you, and nobody has questioned our authority to decide who should be members of the committee. And today you tell us that this can't be done. I said, even if the earlier law officers have not objected, will not change the letter of the law. I said, you please have it for hearing, and I will convince the court that this is a very elementary thing of, on the question of separation of powers, and you have no right to decide who should be in the committee. So I showed them several judgments, and including Constitution Bench judgments, which very clearly laid down that separation of power, though not engrafted in the constitution as a provision in the constitution, but it is something which is very basic. And in fact, Supreme Court in one case has gone to the extent of saying that the question of separation of power is actually the right to equality. And they have said that, and these 5 judges have said that when the legislature wants to enter into the domain of the executive, of the judiciary, then that's something which is not permissible. So it is in that context that the question of separation of power was being considered in that matter. But the context be whatever, whether it be the executive getting into the domain of the judiciary, or the legislature getting into the domain of the judiciary, or the judiciary vice versa getting into the domain, the principle will remain the same. The principle can't change. So when a judgment is delivered by a court, and by an amendment to the constitution or by an amendment to the statute, if that judgment is being sought to be set at naught, then Supreme Court has held that this can't be done, because this is actually contrary to the concept of separation of power. And anybody, any authority which is trying to annul the judgment of the Supreme Court will be against the principle of separation of power. So if that can't be done, then I have argued, and I have successfully argued in Supreme Court in several cases, that if that can't be done, then vice versa also can't be done. And the Supreme Court also can't get into areas where which is exclusively reserved for the executive. So in large number of cases, you will find that in Supreme Court on highly technical issues, issues which require a lot of expertise or a lot of technical knowledge, those are also areas in which you will find Supreme Court getting into, which, because nobody points out that this is beyond your jurisdiction, and they go ahead and decide even on issues which are clearly forbidden for them to do. Like, for instance, recently there was this order of liquor not being sold on highways, and it to be sold 500 meters from the highway. Now, who has examined that somebody who drinks from 5 meters away from the highway will not come onto the highway, and the person who's actually drinking on the highway will actually not drive? These are things which have to be actually seen by the executive, either by a scientific study or by a sociological study or otherwise, and then only a call should be taken. So Supreme Court can't simply sit and say that according to its wisdom, a liquor shop should not be on the highway, and it should be at least 500 meters away from the highway. So what happened was that now, because of that judgment, you must have read in the papers that state after state started denotifying highways and saying that this is not a highway at all, and to justify a liquor shop. Or people started making a 500-meter circuitous route, which was a shop which was next to the highway. So you showed a route of 500 meters just to show that this is the way to go to that shop, and accordingly it's away from 500 meters. So these are laws, according to me, which the court can't look into and can't get into. And if the court actually wants to get into, then it should ask the government to give a study as to whether there should be such shops on the highway or not. And if there is clear opinion on that issue, then request the government itself to look into it rather than pass a judicial order on that. Similarly, when I was appearing in a matter concerning the Taj Mahal, again, when I was the Additional Solicitor General, I was appearing for the CISF, and the Solicitor General was appearing for the Archaeological Survey of India. And it was before a 3-judge bench of Justice S.B. Sinha. So a question arose as to how people should enter and exit from the to go into the Taj Mahal. So I remember the Solicitor General suggested to the court that why doesn't my lords come to Agra and see how this could be done, and give us a first-hand, after seeing it first-hand, to give us some direction how this should be done. I was appearing for the CISF. I had really no role as far as this particular aspect of the matter is concerned, but I immediately objected. I said, I don't think your lordship should go and see this kind of a thing in Agra, because this is a subject which is meant for experts, and these are people who look into these aspects as part of their job. And your lordship will not be in a position to decide by simply going there as to how things to be done. So when I objected, the judges agreed with me. The point that I'm working to make is that if nobody had objected, then the judges would have been in Agra and have been seeing, how things should be done. So it's actually my experience in the bar is my 30 years of experience in Supreme Court is that most of the time, this kind of judicial overreach happens by consent, and the judges very rarely are having that kind of vision to tell the executive and tell the officers, law officers who are appearing before them that, look here, this is something which is not within our jurisdiction, and this is something which the executive should decide. Because nobody wants to, not accept the power that everybody is wanting it to exercise. So most of the time, the government officers who appear for the government or the private, of course, office or private lawyers definitely want the court to rule on every subject that it can think of where a determination is required. And if the government law officer also does not object, then the court invariably gets into that subject and starts deciding issues which, really speaking, are beyond its powers. So when we talk of a continuing mandamus, when we talk of judicial overreach, so for instance, environment matters, or there are other important matters where public interest jurisdiction should be utilized, like for instance, in this migrant labor issue, when this COVID-19 happened, and this lockdown was imposed, it was a very necessary step. Nobody can deny that. If you look at the common man, if you look at the migrant labor, if you look at the daily wager, so to say, the fundamental right of a migrant labor or a daily wager was really very badly violated by this lockdown. His life and liberty was at stake. His being able to live a life of decent existence by earning even a small wage of 100, 200 rupees a day, and then feeding himself and his family by that process was taken away. And there was nobody to, sort of give them shelter. The government also, in the first notification, did not think about them. In the second notification, the government banned their movement from one state to the other. And experience has shown in the last 2-3 months as to how migrant labor came onto the street because they were actually forced to a situation of starvation. So they said, if I have to die, then might as well go to my village and die there rather than dying on the streets like this here, without any work and without any wage. And how they were forced to pay their fare while going back on those trains that were started for them. They were forced to pay doctors to get that medical certificate, without which they were not given, they were not allowed to travel. They were not provided for food on the way. So these were issues which I felt that the Supreme Court should have intervened. And large number of high courts did intervene and gave a lot of relief to these kind of people. Because for a middle income person or a higher income person, the lockdown did not mean violation of their fundamental rights. It did inconvenience everybody, but it did not inconvenience to the extent that your life and liberty was being threatened. It was just an inconvenience for most of the people in this country. But the real badly affected were the ones who did not have any, nothing to rely upon or nothing to live on during the period of lockdown. So these are issues which I feel that the court should interfere. But the issues where the court should not interfere, which is interfering, is the cause for concern, and that is what is judicial overreach all about. I also remember once a matter was being argued in Supreme Court as to pollution, how the pollution of city of Delhi should be checked, and how vehicles should not be allowed to be allowed to come into Delhi without some kind of a check on whether they are necessary to come into Delhi or not. So a Solicitor General again was telling the court in one of those hearings that your lordships have stopped vehicles coming from Haryana side, but please pass an order for stopping vehicles coming from UP side also. So these are again areas where I feel that the executive is completely shirking from its own responsibility and inviting the court into domains which are not meant for the judiciary. The Solicitor General could have easily advised the government to pass a notification under the Motor Vehicles Act, asking by the notification doing exactly the same what he was wanting the court to do by a judicial order. So most of the time, judicial overreach is happening because this kind of jurisdiction is being conferred upon them by consent. And the judges also, without realizing that this is something which is beyond their area, go deeper and deeper into that aspect, and it invariably amounts to a huge amount of judicial overreach. I remember when the Babri Masjid the demolition case was being Babri Masjid demolition was about to happen, and the matter was being monitored by a bench of Justice Venkat Chalia. He was not the Chief Justice then; he was in court number 2. I still remember I was in court, and Mr. Milan Banerjee was the Attorney General. And there was a build-up around the Babri Masjid, and a lot of people had assembled there. And somebody mentioned that matter before him, for Justice Venkat Chalia, and the Attorney General said that we have kept the entire paramilitary forces at your Lordship's command. And if your Lordship want us to move the paramilitary forces, we will do so in whatever way your Lordship want us to do. And I very distinctly remember what Justice Venkat Chalia said. He said, Mr. Attorney, don't expect us to do your dirty job. This is your job. You have to decide how to stop whatever you need to stop. You can't expect the Supreme Court to take over the governmental functioning in this way and decide, BSF to be posted here and CRPF to be posted there, etc. So, I mean, it's a different matter that the Babri Masjid demolition still did take place. So that really is a failure of the executive in protecting the structure. And we all know which government was in power and how all that happened. But that apart, as far as the court is concerned, the court exactly knows or should know what is the limit of its jurisdiction and should never exceed that jurisdiction. Because the moment you start exceeding your jurisdiction, then you are completely giving a go-by to the question of separation of powers. And the self-discipline invariably doesn't kick in unless somebody informs the court that this is an area which is not meant for the courts to adjudicate, and the judicial overreach happens in the process. There are actually large number of cases where if the vice versa were to happen. So for instance, supposing tomorrow the parliament were to pass a law that if judiciary doesn't decide something for the next 5 years, or any cases which is unable to decide for 5 years, will be taken over by a tribunal, or will be taken over by the executive for decision making or for settlement. That also will be completely contrary to the doctrine of separation of powers, because even though there is delay, ultimately this decision making power or this power to adjudicate upon disputes vested clearly with the Supreme Court or with the courts, and that power can't be taken away by the executive or by the legislature. So this is also something which has to be always kept in mind, that this separation of power concept is like, in a circle you have 3 different compartments, and the lines for each compartment is very clearly drawn. And the judiciary, while having its line very clearly drawn, many a times blurs that line and crosses into the other part of the same circle, like going into the areas which are meant for the executive or meant for the judiciary, for the legislature. But if reminded that, look here, this is not within your power, this is not within your jurisdiction, it has always retreated back. So when you look at the judgments or the pronouncements of the Supreme Court, both ways, whether it be when the government wants to come into the domain of the judiciary, or the legislature wants to come into the domain of the judiciary, or if the judiciary were to be asked to go into the domain of the executive or the legislature, whenever the court has been asked to decide this by a judgment, the Supreme Court has never faulted. The Supreme Court has always ruled correctly, and I can tell you there are at least hundreds of judgments where Supreme Court says that this is something which is beyond my power, and this is something which has to remain. The few judgments on the question of contracts, when the government is to decide whom to award a particular contract, Supreme Court has always said that there has to be a free play in the joint, and the government will have that discretion of finally deciding who is the best person to be given the contract, and the court can't substitute its own decision. The yardstick for court's interference is that the court will not substitute its opinion to the opinion of the executive. Even if the court were to feel that this decision is not correct, that itself is not a ground for interference. The only ground for interference is that if natural justice is violated, or if there is a complete procedural anomaly in this selection. So, for instance, if there is a particular method in which the thing has to be done, and that is provided by statute, then if the statute is not followed or if the procedure is not followed, then interference by the judiciary is possible, but not otherwise. So that free play of the joint is something which has been developed by the Supreme Court itself to say that these are areas where courts will not interfere, and always the executive will have its final say as far as whom to give a particular contract, or who is the best suited party to execute a particular contract. So this again is a area where this judicial overreach is to be avoided, and the Supreme Court has always rightly done so. But when the transgression takes place, and many a times, as I have said earlier today itself, that many a times it is necessary, and those cases are where when you are talking of intergenerational equity, like for instance, environment, problem that the court has to face is that the politician looks at the next election, whereas the judiciary many a times has to look at the next generation. So when you look at the next generation, it is called intergenerational equity. Then you can't let the politician take a decision for the purpose of winning his next election, which may be a couple of years away, at the detriment of the damage that it may cause to the next generation. So that is where the judiciary has to interfere, and does interfere, and should interfere in many cases. You will all recall how Delhi was polluted, and the CNG was enforced by the Supreme Court. And I remember the government and industry all were crying in Supreme Court that CNG can't be brought in like this, and there are no enough CNG pumps, and there is no opportunity for bringing in so many CNG vehicles in a short period of time. But Supreme Court was very firm in its order, and Supreme Court said no question, beyond a particular day, every vehicle will have to be CNG. And when this enforcement took place by the judgment of the Supreme Court, you will all recall how pollution in Delhi temporarily became much better for quite some time, and how again we have let things go, from bad to worse, and things are again at the worst today. Delhi is one of the most polluted cities of the world, and people who are practicing in courts, and people who can't change their place of stay because of the nature of work that you're doing are in that sense condemned to suffer this pollution. And these are areas where I feel that courts are in a position to take a large number of unpleasant calls which the executive is not able to take. So these are calls where the court can come in. But in the process of getting into the executive field, one has to be very clear that if you can by prodding the executive ask the executive itself to take the decision rather than the court taking the decision will always be better, because then you are respecting the doctrine of separation of powers. Separation of power, as I pointed out earlier, is not codified. Our constitution doesn't provide for separation of powers in that sense. Large number of constitutions in the world do provide for separation of powers, but ours does not. But by judicial orders and by interpretation of our constitution, it has been held that separation of power is a basic feature of our constitution, and that is how it should be. And according to me, this judicial overreach also, as long as it is for the problem really arises is that when and in what circumstances will one accept that this is an area where court should intervene and this is an area where court should not intervene. So for instance, tomorrow, supposing if like the Rafale deal, in the Rafale deal, if supposing the courts were to get into the nature of the jet and its capability of the ammunition that it is carrying and the speed at which it will fly, if these issues the court would start getting into, then clearly it would be beyond the powers of the court, because that is something which is again for the experts to decide. This is something which courts should never intervene. And rightly so, they rejected the case on Rafale on merits. But as far as the procedural aspect is concerned, supposing if the Rafale jet has been bought by a procedure which can be said to be contrary to the laid down procedure, or contrary to the manner in which such large purchases are done by the country, then definitely for that limited aspect, the court could intervene. But it can't definitely intervene on which jet to buy or which tank to buy, or these kind of large decisions where, or even small decisions where the government is the best judge to take a call on what is the best buy to do as far as the government is concerned. The other areas where the courts can interfere and judicial overreach is accepted today is on human rights violation. On, for instance, if you will recall the harassment of women at workplaces, that Vishakha judgment, because there was a vacuum, there was no law to cover that field at that point of time. So the Supreme Court felt that there can be a judgment to fill up that vacuum and to provide for some kind of a working mechanism or some kind of a arrangement by which people who are facing such kind of harassment could get some kind of a redress. But apart from that, I feel that the areas where the Supreme Court should, sort of entertain petitions which are really speaking within the domain of the executive or of the legislature are very, very limited. And that self-restraint has to be always brought in by the court while adjudicating issues of this kind. And that is why I have also suggested once to the Attorney General and also to the government that within the Supreme Court, when they hear a PIL, which is an original jurisdiction, in a PIL there should be an intra-court appeal, because invariably what happens that if a judge has a certain leaning or a disposition on a particular subject, he tends to take it to the extreme and tends to stretch it sometimes quite unreasonably. And since it's an original jurisdiction, and since there is no right of appeal as of today, the common man who suffers that litigation or who suffers a judgment where the Supreme Court acting as a court of first instance decides something, and if there is something wrong in that decision, then there is no corrective mechanism which can be put in place. So I feel that this judicial overreach, and this also, mind you, can be done by the Parliament. The Parliament definitely has the power under the Constitution to bring in a law to regulate the procedure, the functioning of the Supreme Court. And by that law, it can definitely provide for an intra-court appeal. So original jurisdiction, wherever original jurisdiction is exercised by the Supreme Court, there should be one right of appeal, because one right of appeal is something very integral to any judicial decision-making process. And that is what the Supreme Court itself has held in all other kind of matters. So if you are hearing an original jurisdiction matter, a PIL, which is directly coming to Supreme Court under Article 32, then according to me, one way to ensure that justice is done, complete justice is done, there should be intra-court appeal also, where a original petition could be decided by a single judge or by two judges, and the appeal could go to a larger bench of either two judges or three judges, depending on what is the composition of the court which heard the matter originally. So this also could be a way to check judicial overreach, especially because what happens in PIL, and that is my experience at the bar, that in PILs, the court starts with a small problem. And while examining that problem, without hearing all the experts who are knowledgeable of that particular subject, go and decide on issues which are way beyond the original issue raised in the petition before the Supreme Court. And when a decision of that kind is rendered, then the law says that if you are aggrieved by that decision, the only remedy is review. Now, review goes to the same judge. So there is no question of getting a rethink or a relook on the wrong done by the judge in the first instance. And ultimately, the injustice that happened in the original decision making gets perpetuated because the review jurisdiction is very limited. The review jurisdiction is only based on errors apparent on the face of the record. And that too going to the same bench which heard the original matter, the chances of getting any real justice becomes very, very difficult. And then after the review gets dismissed, the curative is again a very, very limited jurisdiction where again there is no question of because curative, the curative petition is to be filed only if there is a violation of natural justice or if the judge has an interest in the particular cause. So on both these counts, it is almost impossible to fault a judgment because invariably in PIL matters, everybody is heard, so-called, although the issue that they have decided may not have been put to the other side, but really speaking, they have been heard. So there's no question of violation of natural justice. And it is almost next to impossible to say that the judge has an interest in that particular cause. So on these two counts, if a curative petition will lie, that also really speaking is no help for the litigant. And the litigant suffers a judgment at the hands of the Supreme Court in an original jurisdiction without any recourse to any corrective mechanism to correct an error which has happened in the original judgment. So this is again one way in which, according to me, judicial overreach can be checked. And again, the ball clearly lies with the Parliament to enact a law and to provide for this kind of an intra-court appeal, which unfortunately the Parliament has never done. And the Supreme Court rules, can be framed in the absence of any parliamentary law. So Supreme Court rules also have not provided for this. So there being no parliamentary law, nor it being provided in the Supreme Court rules, the judgment of the Supreme Court in a original jurisdiction, in many cases, does huge amount of injustice to the persons who get affected by that judgment, and that is something which needs to be corrected, in my view. If anybody has any question, because I'm almost finishing my hour, I can take some questions if there's.
Thank you, sir, for this outstanding and enlightening address, sir. And it is reflected from the chat box also. Now we are moving to the Q&A section, sir. The first question is from Megha Anand, and she is asking, does judicial activism break the concept of separation of power we all have been reading under constitutional law?
It does definitely break the concept of separation of powers, but as I explained in my address, that there are certain areas where the judicial activism is necessary. Like I mentioned, intergenerational equity, or areas where there is a distress to a common man who does not have the ability to come to court. like the migrant crisis in today. Now there is a migrant labor by himself can never think of even approaching the Supreme Court. So there are certain areas where the court should be interference should be accepted, and it is happening also. But the moment it goes beyond all that, then that is something which is clearly violative of the concept of separation of powers.
Thank you, sir. The second question is from Simran, and she is asking, should the tenure of judges be increased to lifetime as in USA? Then no question of post-retirement appointments will arise, and judges can work according to the law and without any fear.
Well, that is not really an answer to this problem of post-retirement appointment. Post-retirement appointment should be barred by law, or there should be some system where we should do away with this tribunalization of justice. And even if you want to appoint people to tribunals, you should also do that by some open system of merit and appoint even, say, for instance, if you want a judicial member, then you can do that by an open system of merit rather than reserving that appointment for a retired judge. So that retired judge appointment, according to me, is not correct. It should not happen. And wherever tribunals require, then there should be a system of appointing people independent.
The next question is from Abhinav, and he is asking, sir, do you think that NJSC verdict and the basic structure doctrine is judicial overreach?
No, according to me, the NJSC verdict is not wrong, because I have said in my address that the appointment of judges should remain with the judiciary. But unfortunately, the judiciary is not doing its job responsibly. So the judiciary, either by law, should be asked to do it responsibly. So, for instance, there should be a very open system of shortlisting the names. The criteria should be well known to everybody. And once the shortlisting takes place, then the rejection all the names should be considered by the collegium. Unfortunately, all that is not happening. The names being considered are only the names which the collegium members know, and not on the basis of some kind of an objective evaluation. So that's where the system needs to be changed. But I don't think the NJSC judgment is incorrect.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Amitesh Mishra, and he's asking, at which extent judiciary follow the doctrine of separation of powers, as there is no provision for separation of powers in India?
So that is why I said it's a more of a doctrine of self-restraint, and that is why the role of the members of the bar is very important. And whenever the members of the bar, and especially the government council, I personally feel that the government council invariably sort of falter in not reminding the court that this is something which is beyond your jurisdiction. If the government council were to remind the judges more frequently, then the judicial overreach will definitely and considerably come down.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. Bhavna Batra, ma'am, and she is asking that, is the proactive judicial activism diluting or weakening the basic structure of parliamentary democracy?
So if the judicial overreach is confined to areas which I have mentioned to you, and those are only examples, but if it is confined to those, then definitely it is not in any manner. Most of the time you will see that the judicial activism is required because the parliament is not doing its job. Now you will find there are statutes, where a statute drafted 100 years back, and there are no amendments to that statute, and because of which the problems which were there 100 years back are not problems anymore today. And Parliament does not have the time to look into those laws and to sort of provide for corrective action. Similarly, areas like I mentioned the Vishakha guideline, if the Parliament does not bring in law where it is required to or should be bringing in laws, then definitely judiciary can step in and sort of at least give some nudge to the Parliament or to the government, and at least to ask it to open its stand. And if the government is forced to take a stand, then many a times the government ultimately relents in bringing in the law which is necessary. So to that extent, this is something which is a ongoing system where interactive system where each institution is to benefit from the other, and ultimately for the larger good of the people of this country.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as we are running short of time, we'll take the last question from Advocate Animesh from Patna High Court. He's asking, sir, the general practice of appointing advocates for state and union, like Additional Solicitor General, Attorney General, Advocate General, etc., is based on the affiliation of the concerned advocate with the ruling party. Later on, when the same advocate is elevated to the bench, don't you think such practice affect the independence of judiciary? How check and balance shall be maintained in order to save the judiciary from influence of political parties?
Well, as far as the appointment of the law officers is concerned, I feel that the government should not be appointing purely on the basis of people with their particular leaning, because ultimately you have to have good people defending you. And if you don't have good people defending you, then definitely you are bound to suffer in your litigation. But these people, whether they can be again considered for being elevated as judges is concerned, again, it's a very, very personal issue. And if the person has a certain amount of integrity, then merely because he acted for the government at some point of time can't be a ground for him for to non-suit him from becoming a judge. So that, according to me, should not be. If you have a nice independent person to act for you as your lawyer, then why don't you expect him, that same person, to be a good judge also? And in any case, when you take the chair of a judge, your attitude to a case is very different from the attitude that you may be having while as a lawyer. Even if you were to decide tomorrow, anybody were to decide a family dispute, the way in which you think of that dispute prior to being asked to decide it always changes. So it's not as if, with the moment you take the office of a judge, you will start deciding in favor of the person for whom you represented at an earlier point of time.
Sir, we'll take one last question from one of our faculty, Monica Yadav, Associate Professor of Amity Law School. And she is asking, should there be a limit on the discretionary power of the judges? Sometimes this causes unnecessary delays, like in Nirbhaya's case.
Well, Nirbhaya was a unique case, and the delay was, according to me, the way Nirbhaya was decided was in the way other such cases are being decided in the country. Nirbhaya was definitely fast track. Of course, I agree with Monica that this could have been much faster, and the execution especially took a lot of time. But last mile problem in executing 4 people for the same offense was more because the law and the prison manual, etc., the CRPC did not have clear-cut guidelines for multiple executions for a single offense. And if the government had been, proactive and brought in the necessary amendments, this could have been expedited to quite an extent.
Thank you, sir. Vaishnavi Bhargav, one of our students, she is willing to take advice from you for first-generation lawyers.
I am a first-generation lawyer. I can just tell 2 or 3 things which are very important. This is one profession, I can tell you with a huge amount of confidence, this is one profession that if you are ready to work hard, you will have to be noticed. There is no way that you will not be noticed in this profession. That is one thing for sure. So work hard, number 1. Number 2, always have the interest of your client. Never have your interest. So in my career, I have seen, and one of the reasons which I feel that I've grown much faster than others is that I have told people who come to Supreme Court many a times that you don't deserve to come to Supreme Court. The judgment of the High Court is good. Your coming to Supreme Court is wasting money by paying me. And some of them have gone back. Some of them went to other lawyers who, gave them false promises. And ultimately, when their matter got dismissed, then they remembered me that at least somebody gave us genuine advice. So never ever advise something contrary to the interest of the client. If you keep the interest of your client at heart and if you work hard, I think there is no way in which success will not come to your direction.
Thank you, sir, for your replies. We are getting a lot of questions, and as it is decided by director, sir, we'll send it to you for seeking your replies on it, sir. Now, I would like to request Major General P.K. Sharma, sir, Dean and Director, University Gurugram, to propose vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Pranshul, and thank you, Neha, for organizing this wonderful webinar. Sir, Vikas, sir, it has always been an honor and pleasure to interact with you, whether as an officer of the Judge Advocate General's Department and then you were the Solicitor General, or when you visited our university for the moot court competition, you are a sea of knowledge. And it is always when we meet you, when we speak to you, there is so much to learn from you. Let me start from where you left, sir. For the first generation lawyers, I think Bollywood and lawyers, they stand on the same footing. Your parents may launch you, but that's about all. If you don't have the acumen, if you don't work hard, if you don't have the knowledge, you cannot be pushed by your parents. So you are an example of this. You say you're a first generation lawyer and you have risen to such great heights. The entire country looks at you. So we are proud that you gave us time and you shared such interesting things with you. You told me that this is a very favorite subject for you. Sir, it is very surprising that till now the Collegium doesn't have some set guidelines for selection of judges. And that is where the subjectivity and nepotism comes into play. So you also said that the courts, sometimes the courts forget the line between their authority and the outreach. And then somebody has to get up on his legs and remind the court, and then they retract from that. So you have always been doing that. We have seen that number of times. So it's been an honor to hear you. It's been a huge participation, sir. Let me tell you, nearly 320 odd participants in this. And this is not limited to Amity, sir. As you heard from the questions also, a large number of questions came from outside. So we are very grateful to you. We will again bother you, sir. Now that we also know your interest, we keep organizing international conferences and the moot courts. Last time I recollect, sir, you were in a great hurry and we could not felicitate you in a proper manner. So we will have to make good that. And when the university reopens and we organize some events, sir, it will be a great pleasure to have you amongst us in person. I must thank all the participants for their wonderful participation, the level of questions that they have asked. I must thank my organizers for this wonderful event. Thank you very much, sir.